Glad you could come this evening. We're continuing our study of the book of Habakkuk. I'd like to turn, please, to Habakkuk chapter 1. We'll be beginning in just a few moments in verse 15. Verse 14. Habakkuk chapter 1 and verse 14, please. We have discussed the fact that Habakkuk is one of the prophets during the period of Judah alone, after the northern nation had been taken captive by Assyria. God was warning the people of Judah, the southern nation, that they too would go into captivity for their sins. Habakkuk has a question, a problem that he is dealing with as we enter into from the very beginning of the book. And what is his problem? What question is it that Habakkuk is dealing with as the book begins? Terry.
Why God is not acting against the wickedness that he sees. Okay,
so he sees wickedness in the nation of Judah all around him. He describes the wickedness that he sees, and he's asking God why he's allowing this wickedness. And God's answer is that he's going to use the Chaldeans to punish those who are wicked. So that's the problem that Habakkuk has. He's seeing violence and trouble and iniquity and so on, and the law doesn't seem to do anything about it, doesn't seem to solve the problem. And so the righteous people are surrounded by this kind of evil. So he asks how long it's going to continue. And we pointed out the fact that we have issues like that too. Questions: why does God allow evil? Why is there around us these continuing problems of wickedness? And why God is allowing it to continue? So what's the basic answer that God gives? The first answer that he gives as to what he's planning to do about this. What's his answer? Habakkuk says, why does the evil continue? What are you going to do about it? And what's the answer? Susie.
Well, his basic answer is, I'm aware of this. It's not something that I'm not aware of and that I'm not going to deal with, but in my time, and it will be by the Chaldeans.
Okay, so God's answer basically is, I'm going to take care of this, but it's going to be by the Chaldeans. I'm going to bring the Chaldeans to punish the people of Judah. And so we discussed in our most recent study different characteristics he describes of the Chaldeans, that they're fierce and they're dreadful and they're self-reliant, swift and violent, and so on. And so here's this description that takes us down to verse 11 of chapter 1 of this very wicked, evil nation that God's going to use to punish the evil people in Judah. Which brings to the next question that Habakkuk has. What's his question then? What's his concern then? And God said, I'm going to take care of it. I'm going to send the Chaldeans. Why doesn't that satisfy Habakkuk? What's his next question? Terry.
Well, he wants to know why would he use a wicked nation to punish them, but somebody more wicked than they are.
Okay, so in verses 11 and 12, he says, you're a very righteous God. You don't appreciate or respect evil. You can't look on wickedness and those who deal treacherously. So why are you allowing or using a wicked nation to punish a nation that's wicked? In fact, the wicked nation you're using is even more wicked than the one that they're punishing. So that's the question, that's the problem. That's where we were at the end of our discussion last time. And so we closed the discussion last time by pointing out a number of examples in which God has used historically in the scriptures, has used wicked people for his purposes. So what were some of those examples? He's going to use Babylon. Though they're wicked, he's going to use them to punish Judah. Or some other examples that the Bible lists where God uses wicked people for his purposes. Frank?
One of the ones that we mentioned was Pharaoh and the Egyptians against the Israelites.
Okay, so he used Pharaoh, who was already wicked, but he used him to demonstrate God's power in leading Israel out of slavery. Other examples? Velma.
He used the Romans to crucify Christ.
Okay, the Romans crucified him, and the Jews denied him and insisted on it. So here were wicked, but did he make those people wicked? No, they were already wicked. He didn't make that. They had their choice, but they chose to be wicked even before he ever used them. But knowing then that they were wicked and knowing how they would react to the different situations, he used them for his purposes. So you've got Pharaoh, you've got Babylon, and you've got Assyria punishing Israel, and the Jews and the Romans who crucified Jesus. All of these examples of God using wicked people for his purposes. Okay, other examples or comments? All right, so the ones that we listed then were, Judas. God used Judas to betray Jesus. Pharaoh, the Jews and Romans, Assyria. The very fact that he used Israel to bring Jesus into the world. Was Israel a basically righteous nation? Much of the time they were not. In fact, God very plainly told them he wasn't using them because they were so righteous. He was using them because he had a purpose to fulfill a promise to Abraham. And so they were often wicked in their history, yet God used them. And so this is, though it's a challenging thought, this is where we left at the end of class last time. God is able to use even wicked people to bring about his purposes for the good of his people and of his plan for mankind. Questions or discussion? That's where we were at the end of class last time. Questions or discussion before we move on? All right. So Habakkuk has the question then, why would God allow this wicked person to devour someone more righteous than he? That's where we are as he's asking that question in verse 13, and we'll read verse 14 through 17 then as we continue the chapter 1. I'd like to read chapter 1, verse 14 through 17 for us, please. Chapter 1, verse 14 through 17. If you'd like to read that for us, please. Frank?
You make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. He brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his dragnets. So he rejoices and is glad. Therefore, he sacrifices to his net and makes offerings to his dragnet. For by them he lives in luxury, and his food is rich. Is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever?
Okay. So here Habakkuk uses an illustration to describe the kind of people that these Chaldeans, the Babylonians, are. What does he compare them to? What's the illustration? Verse 14, and we're now, let's see, where are we? Question number 27. What's the illustration? What is he comparing them to? Frank?
Well, catching fish and crawling things in a net, bringing them up with a hook or a net.
Okay, so to him, the Babylonians, the way they are capturing other nations and taking people into captivity, taking their wealth and so on, is like a fisherman fishing in the sea. And he fishes catches a fish with a hook or the net or some other creature from the sea, and he uses it for his own benefit. So, in verse 15, he says, they take up all of them with a hook, catch them in their net, and gather them in their dragnet, therefore they rejoice and are glad. Talking, I believe, then about the Babylonians. That's what the Babylonians do with these other peoples around them, the other nations around them. They capture them, take them captive. Okay? Now, first of all, well, we'll get into verse 16, and he makes the real main application, but in what way is this accurate? In what way is this a good illustration of what the Babylonians would do? How does this fit their conduct? Susie?
Well, they weren't satisfied with just a few little people. They needed a dragnet to cast it out over all the nations and drag in as many people and their spoils as they could.
Okay, so first of all, they just want as much as they could. They didn't want just a few little fish. Whatever they caught, they wanted more and more and more. Okay? So first of all, it was a sense of greed, that they wanted so much. In the other ways that it would be similar, as an illustration, Frank?
Sweeping through, taking them and no escape for the people because there were so many of them, and they were taking them dead or alive.
Okay, so the fish were hopeless, or helpless, I should say. They were just victims, being victimized by the fishermen. In this case, the nations were being victimized by the Babylonians. Okay? Does the fisherman sympathize with the fish? Oh, poor fishy. You know, I hate to do this to you. Is that how he feels about the fish? Well, I've been fishing sometimes, and that's pretty much not the way it is. And that's the way the Babylonians were about the people that they caught. They had no sympathy for them. It didn't bother them at all. The problems or the agony, the loss and suffering of the nations that they were capturing, they were heartless, they were cruel, and they didn't care about the effect they were having. And so Habakkuk compares them then to these fishermen. But then in verse 16, what more do they do, which is even more ridiculous and extreme, besides their cruelty in catching other nations, like a fisherman catching fish? What else does he say that the fishermen would do then in verse 16 that illustrates the Chaldeans? Verse 16. Rick.
They had burned their nets and sacrificed to the net as worshiping their own god of plenty.
Okay. So if it would be like the fishermen, having catch all these fish, would worship his net and sacrifice to it, burn incense to it, as though it was his god, because it was providing for him so richly, so plentifully. And that's what the Chaldeans were doing in the illustration. Who would the Chaldeans express their gratitude for when they won their victories? Did they give the credit to the true God? They honor God for it? No, they took credit to themselves, didn't they? We've seen that before in the chapter. Talked about themselves, their armies, their power, their military might. And that's what they gave thanks to and appreciated, was how great they were. But they didn't give honor to the true God. And that would be like a fisherman worshiping his net because he caught the fish for him, rather than appreciating the fact that God had made provision for him. Okay? Other comments on through verse 16? Anybody? All right, and so he concludes then that, so they continue to do this without pity. Notice the last part of verse 17, without pity. Are they going to continue to be able to do this? What you're telling me, Habakkuk is saying, is, God, what you're telling me is these nations, these Chaldeans who have been so cruel and so wicked to so many nations, you're going to let them continue to do this. And they're not giving you credit for it. They're not honoring you. They're taking credit for themselves and their own abilities and their armies and so on. They're greedy and taking all these nations. And you're going to continue to allow them, even to a point of allowing them to take Judah, your people, who aren't as bad as they are. You're going to allow that to continue to happen? In essence, that's Habakkuk's question as far as I can see in the chapter. Okay, comments on through verse 17 on Habakkuk's question? Okay, so the first question then is, what are you going to do about the evil in Judah? God says, I'm going to send the Chaldeans. Habakkuk's next question, what are you going to do about the fact that the Chaldeans are so wicked? What about them? They're wicked too. How can you use them to punish your people? So that's his problem. That's his concern. And so in chapter 2, we're going to see that he's wanting the answer to that question, and that's what we go to in chapter 2. Questions, comments through the end of chapter 1, anybody? Okay, I did ask you the question number 29. How do we sometimes make a similar mistake, or not necessarily personally us, but people, make a similar mistake to the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, in honoring the fishermen, honoring his net, the Chaldeans honoring themselves and their armies for their victories and so on? How do people today sometimes make a similar error? Rick?
By not giving honor and glory to God and saying, look what we did.
Okay. Isn't it very much similar so often as we look around us, even in our society, that when we're richly blessed, wealthy, how many people really seriously give God credit for the good things we have in this country? and when we have maybe good health, do we give credit to God, or do we just talk about our wonderful medical people? When we have good jobs, do we give credit to God, or do we talk about our good economy and our good government that provides for us? Even though we may not be as cruel, maybe, to other people as the Chaldeans were, it's so easy for us and people in our society to have the same kind of problem that when good things happen, we take the credit to ourselves or to other people rather than giving credit to God for it, just like the Babylonians. Okay? Any other comments then? And the questions and discussion through the end of chapter 1. All right, let's read some more then in chapter 2. Let's read 1 through 5. We'd like to read chapter 2, verses 1 through 5 for us, please. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. Tim, please.
I will stand my watch and set myself on the rampart and watch to see what he will say to me, and what I will answer when I am corrected. Then the Lord answered me and said, Write the vision and make it plain on tablets, that he may run who reads it. For the vision is yet for an appointed time. For at the end it will speak, and it will not lie. Though it tarries, wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not tarry. Behold the proud, his soul is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. Indeed, because he transgresses by wine, he is a proud man, and does not stay at home, because he enlarges his desire as hell. And he is like death, and cannot be satisfied. He gathers to himself all nations, and heaps up for himself all peoples.
Okay, so Habakkuk's asked this question at the end of chapter 1. Basically, why are you using the Chaldeans who are so wicked to punish the people of Judah, who are wicked, but they're not as bad as the Chaldeans? So why do you use the Chaldeans? And so in verse 1 of chapter 2, what's he going to do? What's he planning to do now, having asked the question? Velma.
He plans to sit in his tower and just wait and see and wait for an answer from God. And then he will see how he will answer his reproof from God.
Okay, so he said, I'm going to wait for the answer. So he's like a watchman on the rampart, or when we talked about watchmen before, on the walls of a city, watching for danger, enemies coming or whatever. But in this case, Habakkuk is watching for God's answer. So he's going to stand and wait. He's basically, in other words, he's saying, I'm waiting. I want to see what God's answer is to this question. And he's wants to know what God's going to say. Okay? And sure enough, in verse 2, God gives him an answer. Not necessarily what he was looking for, but he gives him an answer. Okay? Comments, verse 1? All right? So here we come now to the answer as it begins in verse 2. Let's see. Where are we now in our questions? Question number 2. First of all, God tells him to do something with the message in verse 2. God's going to give him an answer. What does he want Habakkuk to do with it in verse 2? What's he supposed to do with this answer? Neil.
Write it down on a tablet.
Write it down on a tablet. Make it plain. Now, the only thing he says is that he may run who reads it. What do we learn from the fact that God wanted it written down? What does that teach us? And we're in question number 3 and 4 now, other scriptures, and what people sometimes fail to understand or appreciate about Scripture, about the written word. Why would God want it written down? Susie?
To show that it was an established fact, and that when it came to pass, they could point back and say, God said this would happen, and it did happen. And so that people could understand plainly.
Okay. All right. If God just let it happen and didn't have any evidence ahead of time, then the people could do, well, like the Chaldeans did with their, in essence, with the fisherman with his net. Well, how do I know God did this? But when God has said ahead of time what's going to happen, this is what's going to happen. Then when it happens, there's no doubt about the fact that God was the one who did it, because he was the one who not only did it, but predicted it. He knew ahead of time, and the only one who would know ahead of time. And so that's, okay, other comments. Why, other comments on that? That is the value in having the written word. Other comments on that? Rick?
It started out with Moses and the Ten Commandments. God sent them down. God was the author of the Ten Commandments. And the Israelites was to know that.
Okay, so before Moses, we didn't have a written word, did we? God spoke directly to the fathers, the patriarchs, the heads of the families, which we call it the patriarchal age. But we're starting with Moses, it was written down. And now, of course, it continues on to now all we have is the written word. He doesn't speak directly to anyone at all. Today, we only have the written word. But one huge advantage that we have in doing that is, here's the record. You can't wonder about what God's plan is when it's written there. When he says, here's what I'm going to do, here's my purpose, here's what I'm trying to accomplish, then the only thing we have left to do is to study it and understand it and live by it, apply it. But you can't say, well, we didn't know. How do we know? Well, the answer is because he's written it to you. Okay? Other comments on the fact that he wanted Habakkuk to write the message down. Okay? So he says, I want you to write it down. And people today, question number 4, who sometimes don't appreciate that, don't recognize the value of the written word. They sometimes say, well, the men, they were just writing their own opinions. They just decided, they just thought they'd write it down. It was their idea. They wrote their ideas. They wrote because they wanted to. But this is just one of so many examples that we have in the scriptures in which it's clear that the men who wrote the Bible, first of all, it wasn't their idea, but second, what they wrote, but it wasn't even their idea to write it. God told them he wanted it in writing. He told them to write, and he told them what to write. And here you have an example of that. Verses like this, I think, are, to me, are very important, very helpful, whereas we just take it for granted most often that, of course, the Bible is the Word of God. A lot of people in the world don't understand the fact that this is not just something that accidentally happened, but it's by the plan and determination of God. Okay. Now verse 3. So what does he tell him? He's going to write now a vision. He's going to see what he's supposed to write. But what does he say about the vision, about the message that he's going to give him in verse 3? What is he to know in verse 3 about this message that he's to write down? Rick?
It will not lie.
Okay, then what's true? You don't have to worry about this, whether or not it's true. You don't have to wonder whether or not it's make-believe, imaginary. This is true. It's true. It said at the end it will speak and it will not lie. Okay? What else did you say about it? Frank?
That this vision awaits its appointed time. It will happen. God is in control. So what God is telling him is going to happen will happen.
Okay, so not only it's not a lie, you can be sure about it. It's going to happen. He says, it will not lie, though it tarries, wait for it, because it will surely come. All right? So it's not a lie, it's sure. If God says it, if he says it's going to do it, you can know it's true, you know it's going to happen. So in the second place, you can be assured it's going to happen. It will surely come. What else do we learn about God's plan for what he's going to do with the Chaldeans and what he's going to reveal to Habakkuk? There's at least one other important point in the verse, I think, it may overlook if we're not careful. When's it going to happen? Rick?
It's an appointed time.
Okay.
Didn't tell us what time it is, but God appointed it.
Okay, it's going to happen at the appointed time. So, Habakkuk can know that God knows what he's going to do and when he's going to do it. How does that answer Habakkuk's question? How does that relate to the concerns that Habakkuk has. Terry.
Well, it tells Habakkuk that he doesn't, God doesn't act on our time. He acts according to when it is the right time. And so, Habakkuk, you're seeing this. It's not time for this yet, but it will come.
Okay.
And it doesn't come till after Habakkuk is gone.
Okay. Other comments? Rick.
Just makes me think of today, in our time. God has said there's an appointed time when Christ is going to come back for us. But day after day we keep going on, and so many people fall away from ever believing in that anymore because nothing's ever happened. Just like it did back here with Habakkuk. God didn't show what Habakkuk was expecting, so he was questioning everything. And we're the same way today. God hasn't done anything miraculous for us to see, but we do have his word. It is written down. But we have to have faith that what God is saying is true, and it's going to happen in his time.
Okay. So Rick's brought up a specific that God has told us is going to happen at the appointed time. In his way, at his time, there's going to be a judgment. Jesus is going to come again, and all people the dead are going to be raised, and they're going to be judged, and we're going to enter into our eternal rewards. What are some other things throughout Scripture and throughout history that God appointed that people didn't necessarily understand, but God knew? He knew what his plan was, and he knew what his purpose was and when he was going to do it. What are some other things that fit like that, Terry?
That the Christ, the Messiah, would come.
Okay, the obvious one is the coming of Jesus. Over and over again, starting at least, well, even with Eve, that her seed, the seed of the woman, would crush the head of the serpent. And all the way, then you got Abraham, and in his seed all nations of the earth would be blessed, and David, that is, this Messiah, the Christ, would be a descendant of David. Over and over again, Isaiah 53, and there's a lengthy description of the death of the Christ, the servant. All again and again, God's got a plan. People didn't understand it. Even the prophets didn't understand it. 1 Peter chapter 1 says the angels didn't understand it. They didn't know, but God had a plan. He knew what his plan was, and he knew when he intended to do it. There was an appointed time and an appointed way. We need to understand that just because we're not in on the plans doesn't mean there isn't a plan. Just because we don't understand what God's doing doesn't mean he's not doing anything. That's a big part of the lesson here with Habakkuk. God's basically telling him, Habakkuk, I know what I'm doing here. I got a plan. It's appointed. It's not a lie. It will surely come at the appointed time. My time, my way. Okay? We won't allow our lack of information about things that God is doing to hinder our service to him. Now, obviously, we need to know what he wants us to do, and he's told us that. That's in the Scriptures. We can know what we need to do. When we start worrying about what God's going to do and what God's doing, to a large extent, that's his business. He may or may not reveal that to us. But don't get upset because you don't understand what he's doing or why. Other comments on 3 verse 3 and God's message as answer to Habakkuk. All right, now verse 4 and the following verses begins to describe the proud whose soul is not upright. Who's he talking about now in verse 4 and 5? Who is this that's proud? Okay, it's the Chaldeans. All right, so remember, Habakkuk said, these people are wicked. How come you're using them to punish somebody that's not even as wicked as they are? And God's saying, okay, I know they're wicked. I know them and what they're like. And so he's going to describe some more things about the Chaldeans, and eventually he will begin to pronounce woes against them for their evil. God knows these things. He's not ignorant or unaware. So how does he describe the Chaldeans in verse 4? The first part of the verse, and then we'll talk about the last part. How does he describe the Chaldeans in verse 4? Right.
They're puffed up or arrogant.
Right, they're arrogant. They're proud. He knows that. Okay? Other comments? Not upright. They're not good. They're not good people. I know they're not good people. They're not proud people. Okay? He'll take care of that eventually, but what contrasts to that? The Chaldeans, they're proud. They're not upright. But that contrasts to who in the last part of verse 4? Rick.
Those of faith, those that have faith.
All right. The just shall live by his faith. So I ask you passages where this is quoted in the New Testament, question number 7. There are some New Testament passages that quote this. In fact, this is the main verse from Habakkuk that is quoted in the New Testament. Where are some places where this is quoted in the New Testament? Question number 7. Susie.
Galatians 3:11. Galatians 3:11.
Okay, Galatians 3:11. And we're going to see it in several places, as I said, and it's interesting to check the context of those and to see what point is being made by it. Galatians chapter 3 and verse 11. Susie, you want to read that for us, please? Galatians 3, verse 11.
Can I start at 10?
Yes, ma'am, you may.
For as many as are of the works of the law are under the curse. For it is written, cursed is everyone who does not continue in all things which are written in the book of the law to do them. But that no one is justified by the law in the sight of God is evident. For the just shall live by faith.
All right. Now, well, let's look at some other passages and then we'll talk a little bit more about it. But notice what he says there. First of all, he's contrasting the old law and those who follow the old law with those who live by faith. Verse 10 is compared to verse 11. Okay, other passages where this verse is quoted in the New Testament. Rick.
Romans 1, verse 17.
And what's the
The righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith.
All right, there it is again. But notice again, what is it contrasted to? In verse, well, not maybe contrast to, but what is it? What is he discussing? What is he explaining in the context there? Verse 16 and so on. The gospel, which is a message of faith. Okay? So each of these cases where it's used in the New Testament, it's emphasizing the faith aspect of it, in contrast to those who would seek to be justified by the law. Now, we studied that a good bit in the Sunday morning adult class, in the whole book of Romans. So it starts here in chapter 1, saved by the gospel for those who believe, because the just shall live by faith. But then he goes on through the book and showing how that we're not justified on the basis of the law, the Old Testament law, or any law like that. What was wrong with the Old Testament law? I don't say wrong in the sense of bad, but why couldn't it save? What was the thing about the Old Testament law that it couldn't save? Terry.
You had to keep it complete.
What happened if you didn't keep it completely?
You were a sinner and there was no resolution to that problem.
Okay. You've got to understand, when the book of Romans and Galatians and even Hebrews, all three of those books, when they say that the gospel is superior to the law, the point is the Old Testament law, there was nothing wrong with the law, but the people didn't keep it. The only way to be saved under that law, if Jesus had never come and died, the only way anybody could be saved under the old law would be to never violate it, never do anything wrong. Well, how many people did that? Well, nobody except Jesus. So nobody could be saved under the law. because, Hebrews chapter 10, the sacrifices of the law, killing of the animals, couldn't remove the sins. It just kept coming back. You couldn't get rid of it. It kept coming back. Every year you'd have to offer another sacrifice. No law like that is going to save anybody. As long as you're talking about a law that doesn't have a provision for forgiveness, you can't be saved. Well, there's only one law that has provision for forgiveness, and that's the gospel, which has the sacrifice of Jesus, which also provided for the people before Jesus died as well as after he died. But the emphasis, and that's why these passages in Galatians and Romans, and come back to this, because here's a passage in the Old Testament. The Old Testament is showing that if people want to be saved, if they want to be if they want to be truly just, they have to have faith. It's on the well. What are some examples in the study in the book of Romans on Sunday morning of Old Testament people who had to have faith to please God? What are some examples of Old Testament people who pleased God by faith? Abraham. Pleased God by faith. Susie?
Well, Hebrews 11 has a whole list of people.
Okay. The whole list of people. And the other verse that talks about Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4 is in Hebrews chapter 10, right before Hebrews chapter 11. And so, and Romans chapter 4, when we studied that, the lesson you need to learn, even from the Old Testament, the only way those people were going to be saved was by faith. Now, they weren't having faith in their animal sacrifices. They were having faith, basically, that God knew what he was doing. They didn't really understand about the coming of Jesus. They had some prophecies about it, but a lot of things they didn't understand. They certainly didn't understand the fact that the Son of God was going to come in the flesh and die as crucified and so on. But God had his plan. It was appointed. And so, even from the Old Testament, the just will live by his faith. Okay? Now we've got the sacrifice and the New Testament with its system of forgiveness through Jesus. Now we can see how all of that was being developed. But just like Habakkuk's confusion here about the Chaldeans, the people in the Old Testament, there was a lot of things they didn't understand about God's plan. But God's plan always had been, the just shall live by his faith. Okay? Other comments through verse 4. And God's description here of being justified by faith. Okay, now just a comment for you to think about. I used to think that meant that your faith should teach you how to live your life. Like 2 Corinthians chapter 5, we walk by faith and not by sight. I really don't think that's really the point, even though it's true. I really don't think that's the point here. I believe what it's saying is the people who have faith will live. That is, they're the ones who are going to have a life before God, in contrast to those who are punished. Now, if that's not what you get out of it, okay, but I think that, to me, I think that's what he's saying. That those who will follow God and trust him will be justified. And the end result is they will live. They will be pleasing to God, eternal life ultimately, and so on. Are there other comments to verse 4? Anybody? Frank?
But to live by faith under the old law, the fulfilling those acts that they were of worship that they were commanded to do, that wasn't what he was talking about as being living by faith, but to do justly and do good to all men.
Well, yes and no. They still had to do what he said about the animal sacrifices and so on. That was taught. So they still had to do that. And I don't know how well they understood in the long run that wasn't really what was going to forgive their sins, but they still had to do that when they sinned, because that's what he said to do. But when you get to the sacrifice of Jesus, that's when the blood, that sacrifice actually occurred, that went back to forgive those sins who did live by faith under the Old Testament, so that they could have the hope of eternal life.
Living in obedience.
Yes, and trusting God. Because you know you've done wrong. Abraham knew he did wrong. Jacob certainly, and David, they knew they'd done wrong. They knew they needed forgiveness. But God had a plan, just like he's telling you about Habakkuk with the Chaldeans. Okay? Other comments through verse 4, chapter 2. Anybody? Susie? Eeny, meeny, miny, moe. Oh, Feldman, okay.
With question 8 here, you asked to explain about the principle of the faith of Habakkuk.
Yes.
If he did not have faith in God's care for him, he would not seek God for answers.
He would not what?
He would not seek God for answers if he didn't have faith that God would do something about it.
Okay. And ultimately, that's what we need to. We need to have the faith that he may or may not tell us the things we would like to know, but we serve him anyway. Before we're done with the book of Habakkuk, Habakkuk's going to say that in very poetic language. Whether I understand what he's doing or not, no matter what I have to go through, I'm going to trust him. That's the lesson of the book of Habakkuk. Trust God to do what he's going to do, what is right, whether you understand it or not, because he's God. Okay, anything else before we close? All right, take up with verse 5 then next time. Thank you.